Hello everyone, welcome to MJC School, and today we are going to talk about Spring best practices. And today our speaker is Jose. He will tell us some advices how to make our Spring application better. And as usual, you can post your questions in the chat if you have them. So Jose, you can start.
Thank you. So today I'm very proud to be with you and speak about Spring. And I understand that most of you already have some experience on hands-on dealing with the Spring applications. So we won't stick too much in the details. Most of them are already well documented, but feel free to ask away if something is not clear enough for you. I'm Jose. I'm senior software developer at EPAN, about 1 year. I started way before Spring exists, and I understand the importance of Spring in the applications because back in the day, applications tends to grow a lot and to become a lot messy. And Spring came in order to rescue us from this complication of the dependencies of objects and having to deal in how to initialize these objects properly. The agenda for this presentation is about a little Spring overview. We won't stick too much on the details, as I said, because Spring is very large, very complex. It's not just a framework; it's an ecosystem of libraries and a different set of applications. So we won't tell much about all the details. We talk about configuration, dependency injection, auto configuration, how to global exception handling, some AOP, aspect-oriented programming, about Spring profiles, and how to structure your project. A little bit of how Spring Framework exists and how it was created. It aims basically to glue all the objects on themselves, basically provides the dependencies we need to create a new instance. For example, if I want to connect to a database, how do I set up all the data needed, for example? So I don't want to repeat myself every time, and I need to have some sort of a tool to help me on how to connect in different types of infrastructure and environments. So Springs helps a lot on this. It focuses on the speed, simplicity, and productivity because, as I said, it helps us on build all the scaffolding and how to connect these objects each other. Right now, Spring is probably one of the most popular Java framework. About 40% of all apps in Java use Spring Boot, 36% Spring MVC. When I started, it was mostly MVC projects. Back in the day, we didn't have much of the new concept for React applications, rich interface. So it was much about response and request and response. But today things evolved a lot, and the Spring MVC followed down in terms of popularity to the new JavaScript front ends. And because of that, Spring today is most used in backend, not many projects using front end. And it's used by many large companies, for example, Netflix. About the best practice, today we don't use XML configuration anymore for Spring. When we started, it was often like this. So we defined a bean, creating some ID, and put some class path inside of this large XML file. So you can imagine about maintaining all those files, right? It's very hard if you have a large team. It's not a good idea to use like this, right? So we evolved to support Java configuration based on annotations like this. For example, we set the type of this bean, and we defined, for example, what this is all about, right? It's about a configuration, it's a service or it's a controller. So it's inside the Java code. It's concise and readable. It's way easier to read the code in Java instead of a large XML files. So improve maintainability and clarity. Supports refactoring because XML files are very complicated to maintain again. It make your development easier because we don't have to merge all those XML files across your team. That's those are the benefits of using Java configuration instead of XML files. We use it constructor level injection these days. But we started using some getters and setters in the very beginning. But today we preferred using constructor injection because constructor are easier, for example, to handle unit testing. If I wanted to test this class, because of the complexity of dealing, how to initialize it and to set the dependencies on the user service in this example, for example, I would uh, I need to create some sort of reflection mechanism to do that. When I do from the directly in the constructor, it's easier and reduce coupling between the classes because it's not directly referenced on a field, for example. So it's easier for us in terms of creating unit tests and initialization of this object. We can see this in the demo later. We can see this in the sample I will provide you. About auto configurations, auto configuration is another feature very interesting because it's a feature that helps you to reduce the amount of code and configuration needed to set up a new Spring application. It does automatically configures your application based on dependencies. So if I add a lot of different dependencies for different drivers, for example, for JDBC to H2SQL or Oracle, etc., it can automatically understand this dependency and adapts your application based on the class path. We use this thing adding the annotations of enable auto configuration or Spring Boot application to one of our configuration class. uh, we can also customize or override the auto configuration by defining your own beans. You can use conditional. This is handy because in different environments, I will talk about profiles later. We can adapt the application according to the different environment we are running. In terms of microservices development, this is very, very important since most of projects will have different environments, different database, even different, completely different set of resources they can use according to the configuration we are deploying the application. Right now, we can try to answer some question if you have any.
For now, I don't see any questions in the chat, so you can proceed. We will ask one more time in the end.
Great. This is about exception handling. Uh, we can see these examples a lot because a Spring application, uh, most of projects today are using REST services. So we create a controller. That controller answers to some requests and handling that request can raise some sort of exception. For example, my database is not available right now when I'm making this request. How can I handle this problem without having to repeat every time the same logic, right? It's not a good idea to handle in each of these controllers the same logic for exception handling. Projects often will create some standard on how to proper log the exception because we want to monitor the situation in production. And if it's not standardized, I cannot extract any sort of useful data from that. I need to to hook some sort of data quality assessment for this application, for this endpoint. So it's better to have a global exception handling. Sometimes this exception handling is not in your project. Sometimes it's a dependency that you import in your project because we are working larger enterprise, for example, and they already provide that for us. So we just import that class and we configure that class. We will see that in the demo on the code, and I don't need to define, for example, how to handle this full controller. I create a controller advice that will answer to all the exceptions related to controllers. We can filter and we can, in the AOP example, you'll see there are many ways to filter those things and how to proper handle them. But it's not advisable to make a new different of exception handling each of those controller classes. It's still about logging and monitoring. It's the same idea here. Since we shouldn't mix our business code with logging. For example, I have some business function one. Business function one is getting some client details, and inside of this code we have a lot of filtering, if then else, while loops, etc. It's purely related to the business. We don't want to, for example, in the same code base, to add, for example, information about how to log the customer function, right? What's happening right now, because it should be very harder for us to maintain this code later. And the solution for this problem often is to use some sort of aspect like this example here. And the aspect can have a point cut. The point cut will filter on by package name, including which part of my code I am interested to logging what's happening. It's called the point cut, right? So we create something like this, we can monitor and can inject all the code needed without having to change the business related code. It's easier for us to maintain like this since they are not even related. About Spring profiles, it's wise having at least one or two, or have some structure in place in the project to allow the use of the Spring profiles, since the Spring profiles defines in which environment this application is running right now. So application need to know. Often this is configured using property files or environment variables. If you understand something about, for example, Node.js, it's the same thing as .env, for example. So you set your environment variable, it reads I'm in dev, I'm in testing environment, or I am in production. And my configuration in this example here will be activated according to this parameter here. Spring profiles, for example, active. Right now it's calling dev. In this case, it's hard coded, but we can have easily we can adapt this code and to set dynamically. Some tools to deploy microservices, for example, Rancher and the others. We can using some interfaces to change those variables and to define which one is that. So we can do this without friction. Don't need even to change the code. We can speak a little bit about folder structure, folder organization, and a properties file. In this case, I need to open my project here, and let's only all displays the project folders. And most of times the projects can have some packages or root packages, for example. It's not mandatory to create data package, for example, but it's interesting to not mix, for example, entities with services and with controllers. This is a Spring Boot application, so it depends a lot of which type of Spring we are using, but most of the times they are more like this. We have the services here separated in one package. We can have as many as needed. For example, each one of treat a different business. We can even have sub packages here. It depends how large is your application. No problem with that. We can always create new subdivisions. No problem with that. The entities that communicates and represents directly the tables, the relational database are here. You have the repositories interface. It is extends some data repository from Spring. It creates a lot of handy methods in order to execute the creation, delete, and updates. The part of I call it web, but it's at your discretion. We differentiate, for example, the controllers. So the controllers are the ones which communicate with the interface directly. So when I call this endpoint API customers, this guy should be called here. Uh, there are many ways to create different folder structure. It's not really set on the stone like this, but most of projects I'm in, they are always creating different packages, for example, for errors, because we can have different even business related errors, exceptions, models, and everything. Often the class that starts, that boots this application is in the root folder. So it's easier for me to run this thing and to boot this application. And we have some resources folder here. For example, we have this application projects. In this case, I have some SQL schemas. I could add other things here, but they are all plain texts. They are not Java source codes. And finally, we have our unit testing. Unit testing should communicate somehow with the source code here in order to import all needed for to work. Even though in this situation here it's called directly the service when it's running, so it boots the application. And we will see later on about unit testing, or they have their own structure here. Okay, so I left with you some reference. You can read about this. I got from these websites. They are very good reference. The Spring reference is a very good one. The Spring IO and all these links are available for you. I'm now open to your questions you may have. and you can comment about them.
Yeah, we have some questions. Let me post them here. Yeah, the first question was, hi, thanks for the talk. Can we have enough information when we use login via aspects?
Yeah, it's advisable to use Aspect most of when we have a large application, and it's easier to understand the point cut logic. It's easier to understand and which are the important parts of my applications. So it's a query. The point cuts are using queries, and these queries allow to you to filter, because we don't need to log everything. We don't need, for example, most of the times we don't have to log. Now I pass through my service. Now I'm calling the repository. Now I'm doing this. Now, sometimes it's just too much, and it
Mhm.
becomes harder for the troubleshoot. The aspect main goal is to facilitate your monitoring and logging your application. So that's the main objective of using Aspect, and it's non-intrusive. It means you don't have to change your entire code base to adapt it. Let's suppose you have thousands of classes. You don't want to copy and paste in each one of these methods the logic to monitor your application. I don't need to do that because it's very troublesome to maintain. It's really complicated. So the aspect is a think like a cross horizontal feature that your entire application is common. So we have the vertical business, for example, customer services, products, those are verticals, but the aspects are horizontal. So it's common in everything, your application.
Yeah, yeah. Could you please open the slide with AOP? I think that will help to understand this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is
Uh,
it.
Yeah, and I think the continuation of this question is, does point cut print each and every method to log file? I mean, we don't need all methods to be printed like private methods or utility methods that do nothing.
Well, often this is not about private methods. I think because, for example, if I have a controller and I have some utility private method calculate something that only makes sense in that class. The point code probably I to be honest with you, I don't have 100% of the certain about this, but I don't think so. It's more likely the annotated with, for example, request mapping. My example here in the slide, and all controllers. So the ones that have request mapping, let me open my code to understand better this question. Sometimes we can have, for example, in get vendor, we can insert a new variable here to do a request mapping. In this case, the point cut should only log the guys with the annotated request mapping, or get mapping, or post, or things like this. So it's not to everything.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think that answers the question. Um, yeah, the next question will be the following. Is it okay to list every custom exception that you want to handle in exception handler annotation, or is it better to make a parent class for all custom exceptions and write it in the exception handler?
Um, the common approach is to create a controller advice. I, Controller advice. Controller advice is what you are calling of parent exception. It should literally hands all class of exceptions instead of having to you handling yourself. It's the common approach. Of course, it always depends. There are products that maybe are different. It's not considered wrong, right? It's not that unflexible like this. We can always adapt. Um, but the idea of using the controller adapt advice is to not repeat ourselves, not having code repetition and
Mhm. Yeah, and one more question about this is, should we create separate methods with exception handler annotation for all non-custom exceptions like method argument, not valid exception, or valid annotation of valid annotation?
uh, separate methods with the exception handler for all non-custom. That's a good question because sometimes we can raise custom exceptions because of the business of those services. I think it's important to uh, because it's related to validation. I think that he's asking this. For example, there are some services that allow me to pass some arguments, but I'm not passing all the arguments mandatory. The REST service itself have a way to do that properly without you having to program it. I think there are notations that allow you to do that. If it's about that you are talking here, method argument not valid. It's about validation. Uh, you I think it's the best idea here. Should you try to validate your arguments because the Spring Boot allow you to add some mandatory or optional arguments because it's easier for you to maintain later instead of creation of each cases. Maybe you have plenty of cases, no?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, one more question is here. What are some recommended strategies for testing Spring applications? For that, for what layer should we write unit and integration tests? Maybe you can share your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I didn't add, for example, end-to-end tests, but you can think this type of test I'm doing here like an end-to-end, since what this thing does, it exactly runs literally like it's deployed the endpoint, and as you can see, he mock MVC, so it's mocking the environment and perform a get in this endpoint, passing this argument, and later on print and expect some HTTP response. So you can call this almost an end-to-end, not really end-to-end because I'm not calling other services, right? But as you can see here, what it does, HTTP method get in all of those endpoints, right? And after I'm testing the response, the answer. In production environments and in CI/CD, because the end-to-end tests are very slow, you can take a lot of several minutes because sometimes one endpoint calls other and others, and it can be a little tricky to create a real end-to-end environment test. But a unit test with mocked data, it's easier. It's you can use, for example, Mockito, and you can test your entire application, and Mockito allows you to simulate the answers. If you are calling another service, it will mock just mock. Let's suppose I'm getting the some date, some timestamp. It can mock the timestamp. It can mock different customers, data, etc. And because we need to test and to check if the code is consistent to what we are doing, not always it's advisable to try the end-to-end full testing, since we are depending on others and it can literally break everything. uh, Again, it depends, but the common approach is just to unit test and try to isolate your application most of the times, and we can have another phase of tests in another environment, completely different environment of the development, and they call it the integration environment. In the integration environment, what it does is really actually calling databases, calling everything, right? So it's a different stage. Um, I think it's more like this, right? But it's not an easier question because it always depends the size of the project.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Next question is here. Speaking of project structure, how and where would you recommend to organize configuration classes?
Yes, we can. The configuration classes are not complicated to separate. We can have, for example, some package in my project here. For example, I could create some config package here, and inside of this, I can have, for example, MySQL, MySQL config, or my Mongo, right? MongoDB config, etc. They are not really complicated for you. It's important to have some structure. You don't want those configs, for example, loose in your application. That's hard to find. But it's not a big deal since they are not that many. Most of the times they are just a couple of configs.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that answers the question. So if not, please post maybe one more question.
Mhm.
Yeah. One more question is here. Also, could you please revisit the AOP login slide and explain it in more details, please? I think we already, yeah, talk about it. So
Yeah,
maybe.
but I
Mhm.
can, for example, because I add let me see, because instead of going to the slide, I can try to show the example I had in this project. Let me try to enter in presentation mode so it's easier for you to see my code. Enter presentation mode. Yeah. So now you can see, for example, we have this guy here. It's called login aspect, right? And as you can see here, it says point cut annotation log. That's it. Just said so you can see this string, and you can imagine this point cut as a query. It will looks. It's some sort of a scan. It will scan your code and see who is the one with this annotation log. Um, I can open for you. Uh, Let me exit the presentation mode because I need to see the folders. I create this interface log here, right? It's a simple annotation, and the log aspect configures whoever class have this annotation log should print. It's called the log point cut here before log point cut in aspect, right? It's a very simple log example. So who is the guy using see. So I see one class using this annotation here. My customer Cersei use this log interface. So I just add this annotation here. So every time I call this get all customers, right? I have this uh, the Cersei here. So every time it's supposedly to print in aspect message. For example, I could do something better, but you understand the idea. So every time I call this part without changing my code that get all customers, right? My code didn't change anything. It enters here. It enters here. It enters in my method called in aspect. The aspect specification is really interesting. There are lots of possibilities for you to do that. This is not the only one. It's just one that I found. But you can, for example, intercept different types if you want. The idea here is I don't want to change my code here related to customer. I don't need to add logging features here, not here in wherever. I only need to keep my code related to logging in this aspect, in this class. So I will not change. I can do the same thing with every part of the application, and the results are always the same. So this is the entirety of the aspect is to add the non-intrusive logic to your application.
Yeah, just I wanted to sum up. So, yeah, here we just wanted to show that for such aspects as, for example, here login, you can use aspect-oriented programming. Yeah, the details about it you can we
Mhm.
can have another light talk, or you can find
Yes, this is
you can find the
yes,
information. It's like
this is very
yeah, there are a lot of it, but yeah, you can use these point cuts um, with your application to, for example, for log functionality or for exception handling.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, one more question about AOP we have is what is price for such concepts of login via AOP from performance perspective?
Um, I think he's asking if there are no consequences and or for example, if it's not detrimental to performance. I think more or less. Yeah, the performance, as always, it depends on what we are trying to do. It's not a good idea to call something that is very slow. For example, the logic inside of the aspect should not. It's not a good idea to do, for example, some calling another synchronous service inside of my aspect. It should not do anything like this. The idea is to fire and forget. So I never see any problem related to performance and the aspects. I never seen before because we always used as something smooth and simple. For example, just writing a log message is not at all problematic to the performance. Spring itself, it's multi-threaded. I didn't have a problem, but I never call it inside of my aspect anything that could impact the performance. Of course, it's a good idea to understand that aspect can impact the entire application if not doing well, because every time you are calling, you if you have thousands of services every time the same code is being called. So that's something
Mhm.
to to think about.
Yeah. One more question about it is, can you please show how to print input attribute filter email of that get all customer methods in point cut, or even give some idea?
Input attributes. I think he's speaking about. Let me input attribute filter email customer. Let me remember where is the filter email. Uh, filter email is the get all. I think. No, I don't remember. Hmm. Oh, I think I get it. What he's talking about. I think I understand more or less what he's trying to ask. Um, well, I need to understand. Oh yeah, he wants to pass as a parameter to the aspect some dynamic information. So, for example, I need to intercept this filter email and to log here. How can I do that? That's a good question, to be honest, because I didn't add this possibility in this demo here. But I think it's definitely possible. I don't think there is any way to not do that. I think, but I just don't know exactly how to do right now. I need to do some research.
Yeah, yeah, I agree that yeah, we have the way to log or to use somewhere
Hmm.
here in our aspect the incoming
Hmm.
parameters, so you can just use it in your log. Yeah, I think we can share the the presentation and the project, and we will try to find how to do it, and you will find after our stream the materials, and you can revisit and review how we can do that. um yeah, one more question we have in our chat. May you share some best practices regarding performance measurements?
To be honest, I didn't find anything about performance and Spring. That's a good question, but anyway, the problems I had before was not related to Spring itself, but on persistence. For example, Hibernate or JPA, about eager relationships. It's not really related to Spring because overall Spring is very uh, solid in terms of performance. But when we are handling microservices, sometimes we need to understand if we need some services to be synchronous or not, or async. If the service can be async, it's better most of the times. If not, uh, never mind. But I think it's a good idea to understand about synchronicity of the services. I think if we really need to call that many services to do something, the Java best practices overall uh, are still valid. For example, the variable initializations and string builders using. uh, and buffers. All these things are still valid, but not really related to the Spring itself.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, for now, there are all questions. Regarding to this question, I can say that, yeah, if you're interested in performance measurements, we can definitely think about the idea of having like a light talk about that. And yeah, we may have this light talk in future.
Yeah, this is a
Uh,
very broad conversation
yeah, yeah,
about monitoring, etc.
yeah, agree. So I don't see any other questions in our chats. I think we can end our light talk. Again, thank you, Jose, for your presentation, for your demo, and for sharing with us this best practices advices.
Yeah,
And thank you everyone who participated, who asking us questions. And see you next week.
bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.